I had a person tell me the other day, I think it was in Virginia, she was saying, my clients, she was a drug counselor, my clients are scared of two things. They're scared of dying of fentanyl, and they're scared of being away from fentanyl. That's an amazing statement, I always thought. She said they are terrified, absolutely petrified of the withdrawals. And the fact is that this is all because these drugs are synthetic. There's no seasons anymore with synthetic drugs, particularly if you have all the ingredients, and they have the ingredients, and they're smuggled into Mexico through the airport or through the ports on the western side of Mexico. And they do, and so you just have this scandalous, staggering, catastrophic quantities of this stuff, and that's why it's nationwide.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Lonely Podcast. I'm very excited about this one because I worked hard to get the next guest on the show. Today I'm speaking with Sam Quinones. Sam is a journalist and a reporter with over 35 years of experience in the business. He has a remarkable story and career. He lived in multiple countries, most notably in Mexico, where he lived for over 10 years, and this is where he published his first two non-fictional novels. He also, throughout his career, worked for and wrote for the LA Times, the New York Times, the Atlantic, National Geographic, and much more. Sam is extremely known for his most two recent books. The first one is Dreamland, the true tale of America's opioid epidemic. This book was published in 2015 and received the National Book Critic Cycle Award at the same year. This book was also recognized as one of the best book of the year by Amazon, Audible, the Boston Globe, the Seattle Times, BuzzFeed, the Daily Beast, and many more. This book was absolutely incredible and had a significant impact on society and the way America and Americans view the opioid crisis. So Dreamland basically depicts the opioid crisis in America. It explained the root causes of it and its devastating effects on so many different communities throughout the country. Sam's most recent book, The Lease of Us, A True Tale of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth, was published in 2021. This book was nominated for the National Book Critic Cycle as well. The Lease of Us provide a very deep dive into the history of fentanyl, meth, and synthetic drugs, and how those drugs really revolutionized the drug market and drug consumption in America. The uniqueness of Sam's ability to tell a story is that on the one hand, he provides you with all the information you need to understand the root causes of the crisis, how the story began, and where it is currently. In addition to that, Sam also provides you with amazing anecdotal stories about individuals. These stories really restore one's faith in humanity and rehumanize those who have been completely forgotten and shunned away from our society. During our conversation, Sam and I discussed multiple subjects, among which what led Sam to investigate these issues, Sam's journey around the country in pursuit of the truth, the effect of the quote-unquote drugification of America, the danger in modern-day synthetic drugs, the unwanted effects of the legalization of marijuana, the role of Big Pharma and big business in these crises, Sam's Marshall Plan to save America, and much more. The last thing I'd say is that Sam is a super interesting person, and I felt that this conversation was really flowing easily. So it was truly one of my favorite podcasts thus far, and I really enjoyed just listening to Sam telling his story, and I believe that you will enjoy it as well. So without further ado, I give you Sam Quinones. The first question I have for you is, why did you decide to go on this journey? Like, what was the thing that interests you in going on, Dreamland?
Right.
And
It began it began years ago, really. I had lived in Mexico for 10 years, and my first two books are about Mexico. People know me for my last two books, Dreamland and The Lease of Us, which you have back there. But really, the first two books I wrote were about Mexico. I was very deeply involved in writing about Mexico, political change, economic and cultural change that was going on down there. I then came back, and a lot of what I wrote about was about immigration. So I came back after 10 years and got a job at the LA Times, which is kind of my hometown paper. And while I was there, the drug war in Mexico kicked off in a brutal, sadistic way that I had never seen in the 10 years that I was living down there. It was all very peaceful. And so I watched with great alarm.
What year was that exactly?
In 2005 is when it really begins to get bad. And then 2006, 7, 8, it just escalates from there. But I was put on a team of reporters at the LA Times to write about this in various ways. And my job in Los Angeles, speaking fluent Spanish, was to write about how drugs once they crossed the border, how they went to the rest of the country. And along the way, I began to understand that we were in the middle of a new heroin boom, which I could not explain because I thought heroin was for the 1970s and early 80s, and we'd left it behind 30 years before or whatever, 20 years before. Why would anybody get back into it? But as part of that, I began to write about this, one of the central stories in the Dreamland book, which is about this town in Mexico, in the little state of Nayarit, a little town called Jalisco, where everybody in the town, a lot of the guys in the town come to the United States to sell black tar heroin, very much like pizza delivery. They're almost like it's a pizza delivery system, except for it's black tar heroin. And they had been expanding across the country, remarkably, I thought, because I just never thought of black tar heroin anywhere but on the West Coast. And so I began to write about them, went down to the town, interviewed a bunch of the guys who were from this town, who were in prison, on and on. And along the way, I put together a story about how this town how the system that they had really expanded. But I still could not explain why they had such a big market for their heroin until I began to realize that I was on the very small story. The much, much larger story was about the opioid revolution in American medicine and pain management.
Yep.
And that had to do with doctors and especially pharmaceutical companies pushing the idea that we now needed to make very aggressive use of narcotic prescription painkillers containing drugs that were, connected to the opium poppy, and that this was a way of eradicating American pain, and that if pain patients were given these drugs, they were not liable to get addicted. There was virtually no chance that they would get addicted, which is completely wrong, but that was what was believed. And so that as that revolution had taken place in American medicine, those pills had spread nationwide, and those pills are opioids, very much like heroin, a cousin to heroin, really. And so people, when they were on those pills, would get addicted, unlike what people believed. That depended on their background a lot. But they would get addicted, and then they would, a subset of those folks would switch to heroin. And all of a sudden, therefore, we had a brand new heroin market that we had never had before. And that realization was tremendous. I did not understand that because I was living in Mexico when this revolution in opioid use took place in American medicine. And so all of a sudden, I was like, oh, wow, well, that explains it. I didn't know what the principal drugs in the story were: OxyContin, Vicodin, Lortab, all of that. I had no idea. But that got me on to this much larger story, which was about how the heroin market that we created really has to do with this transformation of American pain management. And you find the traffickers from Mexico beginning to recognize that. And the first ones to recognize that really were the guys that I wrote about in Dreamland from this one tiny town. And they begin to expand all across the country. 25 states, I think eventually I counted, all from this one little town. And they were remarkable. They were the first ones to figure out that massive prescribing of opioid prescription painkillers would result in a very large new market for their heroin, which is exactly what happened. Then along the way, I had I finished that book. That book did very well, and I wrote. My publisher pushed me to do another one, and that one ended up being about fentanyl and methamphetamine, the synthetic drugs. So you found the trafficking world in Mexico replacing those doctors and pharmaceutical companies as a source of supply, and meanwhile, the traffickers in Mexico going through their own revolution, which is away from plant-based drugs and towards synthetics made only with chemicals, fentanyl and methamphetamine, those two principally. And so that was kind of very briefly, my evolution and how I got into this. And it was basically sparked by my own interest in telling, as a journalist, in telling stories that I thought were not being told and were, kind of nationwide.
Yeah, what's interesting in this thing is, like you said, you lived in Mexico. So would the average person living in Mexico would even know those things happening in the United States? Would this have some sort of an impact for someone who's like from the Mexico perspective? If the question makes sense.
Not much. I remember not being aware of it, and when I lived down there, the opioid thing about doctors prescribing this stuff for all across the country and increasing amounts every year. Don't remember anything like that. I would say back then, particularly when I was in Mexico, the drug traffickers were still very low profile. You did not find them warring on street corners and big piles of bodies and beheadings and all the stuff that came later. You did not see that. They were all very discreet. They were more discreet, certainly, than they are today. Far less sadistic, too, seems to me.
So that's a phenomenon that you think that's a phenomenon that started in the last like 10, 15 years or so?
I would say that it depends what you mean. The phenomenon,
the brutality
of the drug.
The brutality
that started in 2005, principally along the the Mexico border that borders Texas, South Texas. You began to see it there first in 2005, 6, 7. Very scary stuff. Very, really nuts. And but that really had very little to do with the opioid problem in the United States. It had more to do with internal conflicts and so on. And that's a whole other story, much more requiring much more time than we have, I think. But the opioid thing, what it did was it created a new market that did not exist. Before the opioid problem in America, Mexican traffickers only occasionally dealt with heroin because heroin's market was static. It was not growing. Every place you went, there'd be like 100 addicts, most of them fairly old, most of them very tapped out, not having a lot of money financially. They were worn out because they'd been really spending all their money on this, and they lived in motels, and it was not a growth market. It was a pretty scuzzy market too. Nobody really wanted to deal heroin. Most people really preferred to deal cocaine out of Mexico. And then the opioid epidemic came along and created all these new addicts, opioid addicts, heroin addicts eventually, and those folks ended up, they had a lot more money. There were many times more, of them. And that's what the guys from this little town, Jalisco, discovered when one of them in particular, first moved from the western side of the United States, crossed the Mississippi River, came to Columbus, Ohio, just as Columbus, Ohio was really kind of the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. And one guy in particular figured out everybody's using these pills, which he hadn't even seen before. And these pills are very much like heroin. He was a heroin addict himself, this guy. He figured out if I follow the pills, I'll have eventually an enormous market for my black tar heroin coming out of Nayarit. And that's exactly what happened. And the rest kind of is history in a sense. But that's a separate story really from the cartel violence that's down in Mexico.
Yeah. Do you know why Like why Columbus, Ohio specifically?
Yeah, I mean,
Like
well,
is
I
it
think one of the reasons is Columbus, Ohio is the northern edge of Appalachia. Of this problem take place first, right?
right,
And so and the core of the reactor, this is the ground zero of all of this, is Columbus to the north, most of the state of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, parts of eastern Tennessee, and then up to southern Ohio with maybe Cincinnati on the west. So that region right there is very clearly where a lot of this started first. And Columbus just happened to be a place where this one guy landed from which he could see this market developing. And it really was in the story of this one town that I wrote about in Dreamland, this little town of Mexico. It was really this one guy who discovered it. And then when he discovered it, of course, everybody in the town discovered it too. And then within a couple of years, there was like 9 crews operating like pizza delivery, except for black tar heroin.
right, right, right. Yeah. What do you like? I know it's a kind of a big question, but what are the things that surprise you? Like the magnitude of this crisis. Did that surprise you, and how much time did it take you
Oh,
to kind
sure.
of
No,
unpack this,
I would say
understand
that
it?
the magnitude was remarkable. The fact that it was almost uniracial, meaning it was almost entirely white people, a lot of some Native Americans, but just in the percentage of people involved, it was 95% white people. You never saw that in drug problems in the country in the past. It was only it was widely varying. With crack cocaine, it mightily affected the black community, but there was many different races. Every race was involved in smoking crack cocaine without a doubt. And so this was remarkable to see that it was white people of all classes, poor, middle, upper, wealthy, whatever, suburban, urban, rural, whatever. It was really kind of a white phenomenon. I think that was one of the things that most surprised me, because you don't see that with drug use. You see a far greater diversity of races involved.
Yeah. I wonder what you think about the following thing. Like I had a conversation with a guy named Paul Scudo. He's a CEO of a place called Step Denver. It is a recovery place for addicts. They're doing very, very well. Paul
Yeah,
himself was an addict. He's a recovered addict. He was living on the streets of Denver for a period of 2 years. I think it was
right.
before fentanyl was really presence. It was, I think he is off the streets since 2011. But I asked him specifically, I asked him, what do you think about fentanyl specifically? And he said, we had the heroin in the 70s, we had speed and stuff like that later. We had all kind of different drugs throughout time. So he sees it, he says, and today we have fentanyl. Maybe, and tomorrow we have something else. And to me, like, again, reading your book and looking into the subject, I think that fentanyl P2P meth is something very unique. But
I
maybe, I
agree.
guess, my question for you is, how would you determine the uniqueness of this specific drugs as opposed to other drugs that we, again, used to see
Right.
here on the streets?
Two ways, and that is potency and prevalence. So potency, we have never seen a drug so deadly as fentanyl, and we have never seen a drug so deadly as fentanyl spread nationwide. It's prevalent everywhere. It makes it very different from any other drug that has come before. Those two facts, if one of those two facts were not true, we wouldn't be having this conversation about it. But it's the enormous supply, and then the fact that fentanyl itself is extraordinarily potent. And also, of course, on the street, people who are dealing it on the street don't have a very good idea of how to mix it or use it and so on. And so it's creating a lot of death, but it's also creating a lot of addiction. A lot of people are getting addicted. Once they survive fentanyl, they develop a tolerance, and then they need to use it all day long. And so fentanyl, and I would say argue methamphetamine the same way, changes everything. It's true that we have had a long list of drugs and so on, but we have never seen anything like fentanyl. And a lot of this has to do with just the nature of the drug. It is already an extraordinarily potent drug, and that's why it was invented, because it's such a great painkiller and very easy to manipulate by, say, an anesthesiologist. It's a magnificent drug in surgery, by the way. You should know this. Fentanyl is fantastic. I've had fentanyl in surgery. Many millions of people in America in the last 50 years have had fentanyl in surgery. It's when it gets to the street, it's a problem. But the reason it's such a good drug surgically is what makes it unique. It comes in, it takes you in and out of anesthesia very quickly. So you don't feel doped up. On morphine, you spend 3 or 4 hours doped up. But with fentanyl, no, not at all. It's like very quickly. You're almost talkative while you're having your operation, literally on fentanyl. I was anyway. And so that's great in the operating room. On the street, it's a disaster, because what it means is, as a user, as an addict, you are constantly having to use, particularly as it builds up your tolerance. Every day you build a higher tolerance, and now you've got to use all day long. There's no such thing. You don't stop using fentanyl on the street, like that. You constantly have to use it. You need to get off the street, away from the drug, to develop into treatment for that to change. But that's very difficult. I had a person tell me the other day, I think it was in Virginia. She was saying, my clients, she was a drug counselor, my clients are scared of two things. They're scared of dying of fentanyl, and they're scared of being away from fentanyl. That's an amazing statement, I always thought. She said they are terrified, absolutely petrified of the withdrawals. And so they'll stay on the street. They know they're terrified too that fentanyl will kill them. They know this. And any drug they use has probably got fentanyl in it nowadays. And the fact is that this is all because these drugs are synthetic. Plant-based drugs, you have to make them according to the seasons in which you can grow them. If you have the ingredients, and in Mexico they do, coming in from China, those ingredients can be used all year round. There's no seasons anymore with synthetic drugs, particularly if you have all the ingredients, and they have the ingredients, and they're smuggled into Mexico through the airport or through the ports on the western side of Mexico, and they do, and so you just have this scandalous, staggering, catastrophic quantities of the stuff, and that's why it's nationwide. It's all across America. It's in LA, it's up in Washington, it's out in Baltimore, which used to be a heroin town. Now it's a fentanyl town. And so fentanyl, it's true what your friend says there, but fentanyl is really a unique thing. Never have we seen it. We've never seen a drug go nationwide like this. We've never seen a drug kill so much. We've never seen a drug so highly addictive. And the same is true of methamphetamine. It's not as deadly as fentanyl, although many times you find methamphetamine with fentanyl in it, so it becomes deadly. But it's with methamphetamine, they have made it in such enormous quantities that no longer do they cut it, no longer do they dilute or adulterate it, right? So it's made in Mexico, very pure methamphetamine. It's smuggled pretty much like that, and it arrives on the street in that very, very potent state. The tests for the DEA show that they're testing meth that's seized on the street, and it's testing out at 95, 99% methamphetamine. Before, you used to have lots of adulterant in it, lots of other crud that didn't really affect your brain so much. Now it's just straight up methamphetamine, and it's likely that never in the history of methamphetamine, which is more than 100 years old, never have human beings had such a massive dose of such pure methamphetamine without anything else in it hit their brains. And that is one of the reasons why you are seeing, I think, this massive symptoms of schizophrenia and mental illness associated with methamphetamine. But these two drugs, I argue, are really unique because of what I said earlier: purity, potency rather, and prevalence. It's all creates the problems that we're seeing nationwide in counties all across the country.
Yeah. So what was from your experience and from your research there? What was the most common story of someone going down the rabbit hole of methamphetamine and fentanyl? Like, what have you seen? Because I know
Oh, I
just
mean,
kind of the most common story. Because I think that we think some people think when they think about addiction, they think about someone who necessarily went out on the street and tried to consume the drug. They don't necessarily think about someone who was prescribed something and became addicted because of that. So
yeah,
I'm
no, I would
just
say with fentanyl and methamphetamine, people were not being prescribed it. That happened with the opioid epidemic. No, definitely, people were prescribed those pills, and then they became addicted. They switched to heroin, and a lot of those people, early on, particularly in this story, a lot of those people who were heroin addicts were. People want to say, well, they switched. Well, they didn't really switch. They were switched. Passive voice. They were transitioned by the drug supply to fentanyl. Now, when you're addicted to fentanyl, heroin won't keep the drug sickness away. It's pointless to use heroin when you're addicted to fentanyl because it just won't keep the drug sickness, the withdrawals away. You need fentanyl, and then eventually you need fentanyl all day long, as I was saying earlier. But I think that the tip there are no typical story. Well, there's a few typical stories maybe. There's a lot of variation though. And one is that people began, as I said, using heroin, maybe pills, then heroin, then switched to fentanyl. Maybe in other places, people began using methamphetamine simply because it was so prevalent. And I think this was also very much the case in, say, places like Los Angeles, which is more of a meth town than it is an opioid town. But eventually, people grow out of their minds on this methamphetamine. And then eventually fentanyl is in the methamphetamine too. And so eventually they become, a lot of them die, obviously, but then a lot of them become addicted to fentanyl along with methamphetamine. Methamphetamine has a way of, once it becomes very prevalent, of just kind of consuming groups, certain people who thought they would never do it, all of a sudden they're around a lot of people who are doing it, and they do it, and pretty soon they're on the street. It has a way of creating homelessness that I think is profound. It also, though, very important to keep in mind, both these drugs have a way of creating homelessness. They also have a way of keeping people homeless, regardless of the reason why they're homeless in the first place. And that's a huge thing that people don't always consider, that once you're homeless, these drugs are so prevalent. They're in your face constantly. They're in every tent encampment, that kind of thing. And so eventually a lot of people begin using, even though they may be on the street for other reasons. Now they have this other problem, which is very difficult to get away from, given the prevalence and the potency of the drugs on the street, as I said.
I have another question regarding to that. So again, when I was talking to some of the people who work in addiction recovery and etc., one of them referred to the disease of addiction, kept on mentioning disease of addiction and mentioning the fact that 20% have like a prevalency to become addicted. I think one of the most tragic stories of the recent months was Matthew Perry. I think it was just recently discovered that he died of I think it was ketamine overdose.
Yep.
What is your kind of thoughts about this issue of disease of addiction, and how does it play into this whole situation? I guess because not every single person who suffers from addiction actually suffer from this from this genetic proclivity to actually become addicts. So how do you think we should view this issue? And I guess
I would say
that
that I kind of try to leave it to other people to figure out the question of disease. I would say that at a certain point, in many people, it certainly behaves like a disease, certainly. And the disease symptoms is cravings, unbearable cravings, conniving and lying and so on, and betraying all trust in the people. That's part of the symptoms, you might say, of this disease. I would say that the truth is, if it's a disease, then one of the symptoms, I mean, one of the cures would be get people away from this substance that causes this disease in this person. Unfortunately, it's the same people who make the argument for these things being addiction being a disease, who don't understand the notion of how prevalent these drugs are and how then essential to particularly synthetic drugs is you must find a way of getting people away from them, physically separated from them for a long time. I just think that they are, that's the nature of these drugs. These drugs change almost everything we've ever thought about drug addiction. And one of them is that you need to get them away. And the other is that there's no such thing on the street. There's no such thing as being ready for treatment before meth drives you mad and fentanyl kills you. That's the problem. It used to be that this was an idea of being ready, was an idea that implied you have lots of time. You have years. You have years to develop what they still call the gift of desperation, meaning you go through so much crap that all of a sudden you are desperate to get away from all this, right? Well, that's a beautiful idea, and it's part of addiction treatment. The problem is that implies time. And these drugs make it very clear that you may survive for a while, but there's no such thing as a long-term fentanyl addict. And meth will drive you to mental instability and mental illness very, very quickly. So there's no time, right, for being to develop a readiness for this stuff. And that is a huge problem with these two drugs, because before you can develop that readiness, as I said, meth will drive you mad and fentanyl will kill you. And this is what we're seeing on the streets, most parts of the country, I would say, pretty much everywhere in the country to some degree or another. And I've traveled all over the country, particularly since the Lease of Us came out. And I could say that, man, everybody is, the story is repeated constantly. We used to have great variation in regional drug use. You'd go from one place to another, to another, to another, and you'd see different stories of drug use all across the country. Now it's meth and fentanyl, or fentanyl and meth, whatever, And so that's because of the vast supply that's been unleashed by the trafficking world in Mexico on the United States, because they can make the stuff in that quantity and because they have the infrastructure and the know-how to smuggle it.
Yeah, so why do you think, we know, at least I know from my personal experience, that the most, notorious places in the country is cities like San Francisco, like Portland, Oregon, Seattle? Why is that? Is that fair that we look at San Francisco and saying this is the epicenter of this problem? Or is it simply something that happened and became like a stereotype for San Francisco?
No, I would say that San Francisco and those other cities you mentioned are extraordinarily plagued by this problem. I would say that has a lot to do with what I've already talked about, which is an enormous quantity of these drugs. You don't see the problems in San Francisco repeated in other parts of the country where they don't have the politics of San Francisco. However, it's also important to understand that these drugs are everywhere. It's no place in the country really are you finding, no, we have no fentanyl and we have no methamphetamine of the kind that's like cascading into the country now and creating symptoms of mental illness, right? And so yeah. San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, LA, some other places, Sacramento, etc. I mean, there's a lot of places you could mention have tried, in my opinion, to apply ideas that were conceived pre-meth, pre-fentanyl. Not exactly pre-meth, because meth has been around for a lot of years, but it has never been around in the potency and the damaging nature that it is today and the prevalence. It's just simply not true. We don't have any more meth cooks. Used to have meth cooks all across America cooking up little batches of like an ounce or two of meth at a time, and now we don't have any. They've been outcompeted, run right out of business by this very, very cheap, highly, highly potent methamphetamine. So meth is not new. It is, however, this meth is new in the sense that the prevalence and the potency, as I said earlier, are just out of control. And part of the problem is with the cities that you mentioned, I think, from what my reading of it, and I don't live in them. Well, I live in LA, but I don't live in them. Is that you have ideas of how to combat the drug problem that were conceived years and years ago, long before these drugs ever appeared on the scene. And so these drugs have changed stuff so much. These old ideas just don't work. Or they, on the contrary, in my opinion, they exacerbate the problem already. Leaving people on the street today in America who are drug addicts already, and you know this because you Narcan them out into, you revive them from an overdose with Narcan or what have you, is irresponsible. It is not compassion. It is the opposite. It's callous disregard for people who are needing to be off the street. They need to be away from this stuff. They will die otherwise, and they are dying. And you can see this all across these areas, and it's creating a whole bunch of other problems that cities now, feel they have to deal with, like tent encampments and all the public health problems, and of course the violence, and of course the longer you leave people on the street, the other realization ought to be that the street is its own killer, its own vector of trauma. And the longer you leave people on the street, the more likely you're going to die from a combination of the drugs, the beatings, the exposure to temperatures, and all the rest. So I think in the towns that you mentioned, the problem is really that they have tried to apply certain ideas that no longer are applicable, and because of the vast supplies of fentanyl and meth that are coming out of Mexico, which have changed everything.
Do you think they even treat it as a drug problem? Because I had a conversation with someone who is an executive at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't appear to me that they even admit that there's a drug component. They do admit in some way that there's a component of drug addiction to that, but it's not like the main issue. The main issue for them is housing. And I just...
Right. And I would say to you that this meth problem, let's just take that. Meth has been creating homelessness in areas that have no problem with affordable housing. Right. Appalachia has 3 chapters in the Lease of Us about Clarksburg, West Virginia. We'll show you that. And there's many towns around Clarksburg where this was always true. I just chose Clarksburg because I knew people there. I could see it very vividly. That within a year of that meth showing up in scandalous, catastrophic quantities, you began to see huge amounts of homeless people when they had none before. My feeling that the focus on affordable housing is only in part justified. It is in part justified, but only in part. And that's, I think that what we're really seeing now is that there's a whole continuum of issues that go into why people become homeless. And it could be aging out of foster care and not having any family to go to. Could be domestic violence. Your husband beats you, beats your kids, and now you're in a shelter somewhere because you need to get away. Yeah, a person being paroled from prison without any family backup. A person with a surgery and can't afford the rent and the surgery, so has to have the surgery and loses his house because he can't afford the rent. On and on and on. And affordable housing is certainly part of that, but only part of it. And a very big part of it now. Again, it's if you have to think in terms of how the street has changed, how the drug issues on the street have changed, and how fentanyl and methamphetamine have changed the things on the street. And when you get to that point, when you see it in that light, you see that it absolutely creates homelessness, as it did rampantly in Clarksburg, West Virginia, as I wrote about in my book. But as I said earlier, it also perpetuates homelessness. So you may be homeless because you got evicted, you can't afford the rent. That may be entirely true, but eventually, if you stay on the street, it's very high likelihood you'll begin using meth, you'll begin using fentanyl because it's so prevalent, because meth keeps you up at night so you can protect yourself, because all kinds of reasons. But eventually, those become huge impediments, much more important impediments to your own leaving the street and regaining housing than affordable housing has. So affordable housing is part of it, and certainly people who have no issues with addiction or mental illness, a place to live is what they need. It's absolutely essential. The problem is that these drugs are so prevalent, they're so much everywhere in everybody's face, that eventually they become part of the problem if they weren't already. And for many people, I know for a fact, many people have become homeless because they began using these drugs and couldn't live with other people, et cetera, all kinds of reasons, but all connected to their drug use. And then eventually, I would say that drug use and mental illness, drug addiction, mental illness become entwined. And so they're very, very difficult to untangle.
Okay. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's a very interesting perspective that you give, you bring in addition to that. So I want to move into something a bit different, but obviously very much related. In terms of what we call gateway drugs. So specifically marijuana at the time in the past was considered as a gateway drugs. People say, oh, don't use pot, don't smoke pot, because you're going to end up on the streets, addicted to whatever. Today, I just read that the potency of marijuana is something like, let's say in the 60s, it used to be between 10 or 12%. Today, it's extremely potent. It's like more than 10 times more potent than it used to be.
Right.
And, people testify to that. They say like, yeah, this is really, really strong.
Sure.
I just wanted, I guess my question for you is, do you think that has some sort of an impact in, indeed, the fact that we kind of at first stereotyped it as gateway drugs, and then we said, oh, it's all bullshit. It's this concept of gateway drug is untrue. Let's just forget about it, enjoy it. And now, do you think it's fair to say, like, where do you think it stands? This type of drug, specifically marijuana?
I would say that there was a time when that idea, when I was younger, when that idea was circulating. I would say that by and large it was laughable because, it's true that probably everybody who went on to cocaine and heroin back in the 70s and 80s, let's say, probably had smoked marijuana first, but many, many, many people smoked marijuana and did not go on to that. So it came to be viewed as a scare tactic. The problem was, of course, the marijuana back then was, not potent. It was 7%, 3% THC or whatever it was. It was very, very mild compared to this, and you had to smoke a lot of it, and it was also illegal, so it was harder to get, and there was less. There was, it wasn't something that happened very much, that you got to such a problem state with it. But now, of course, marijuana is now 40% bud, 40% THC in the buds, and probably like 80 to 90% THC in the vaping and all that. To me, that it rises to level of it has been shown, I think, very clearly to rise to the level of psychosis inducing, mental illness inducing, stress and just really serious problems associated with it, because it's so potent. It's part, in my view, of a larger trend in America that has to do with the drugafication, shall we say, of all kinds of legal products. So we see now that chicken, this is an example I use frequently, chicken, source of great source of protein and all that, healthy and so on. Now they've got chicken nuggets, and that's 60% fat and salt, and then there's sugar and with the dip, and pretty soon you got fat, salt, and sugar all in one, and that's a highly addictive thing. You've got coffee, right? Coffee has got caffeine in it, but it's mild, a little bit, Then you transform that into a frappuccino that's like this tall with fat, sugar, and caffeine in it. You've drugified these products, and this happens over and over. Now we got apps for gambling. Used to be you had to go to a casino, you had to be around other people, you had to actually exert an effort to get to the place where you were going to gamble. A lot of people became addicted anyway, but now you can do it from the darkness of your own home. Just get that app, kind of video games, pornography. We are seeing Netflix, just says don't. All these companies have mastered the ability to reduce friction to use and increase the we had a lot of cases the potency, for lowering the difficulty with which you use the product, like apps for gambling, increases the potency, increases the potency of the thing. And so what we're seeing is in our economy, it seems to me, American capitalism, corporate capitalism has transformed what used to be innocuous things into highly damaging, toxic things. Social media, you could go on, and there are books written about this, and I think they're very on point. Marijuana seems to me to be part of this. There's no reason why we can't legalize marijuana for commercial sale. It seems to me that is under 10% THC. That's it. Right. But of course, what you're doing when you do that is you're telling people who are selling it, who are demanding to make more and more money and so on, that they shouldn't be allowed to make all the money they think they're entitled to make. We have in this country a real reluctance commercially, economically, to regulate people who are making money. We just do not do a good job of standing in the way of people making money. And you saw this with the opioid epidemic, OxyContin and Purdue Pharma. That was the perfect example number one of these guys want to make their money. We say, okay, go ahead. I guess it's okay. And then pretty soon they create consequences that everybody else has to pay for. And I think a lot of what's going on in America today on the legal side of things is you're finding all these products that in one iteration were great products. And now they become drugified because people know that if you use these products to manipulate individuals, consumers' brain chemistry, they will buy and buy and buy much greater. And I think that's what's going on with marijuana. Why we would legalize 40% marijuana buds, 40% THC marijuana buds is simply beyond me. It's almost like you're turning over the legalization, the writing of the statutes and the laws that make it legal. You're turning over that to marijuana growers. They shouldn't be the ones writing it. Public health and public safety people should be the ones writing those laws. And if public health and public safety were writing those laws, you would see a very different situation with marijuana and dispensaries and so on. It could go on and on about that, but marijuana is kind of part of that larger trend in our country in the last, I would say, 30 years, to just say, well, the free market is king. We obey American capitalism. Whatever American capitalism wants to do, we dare not stand in its way. And you're seeing that with, as I said, chicken, social media, pornography, gambling, on and on and on, all across. You can see many, many of these examples. Marijuana is one of those.
Yeah. Do you think this is like kind of the common consequence of legalizing stuff like that? Like
I don't think this needs to be legalized the way we've legalized it.
So was there any was there any debate on this issue when marijuana was legalized? People were saying, because I know now people are talking about it, and it became like a discussion point. It's kind of the pendulum swings back, but so I guess
we've seen the product. We've seen the result, young kids being really, damaged by this stuff. You've seen people losing all like an initiative in life,
I've seen
I want to do this. And after a while, I don't want to do that anymore. And now we just want to sit around eating Doritos and watching TV, or being, going to the ER. Marijuana may well, I believe it does, have enormous beneficial aspects to it, and we need to study that, but we need to treat it in a mature adult way. and we have not. We simply have not done that. I don't see why we should allow marijuana to be grown commercially that's grown indoors with the massive carbon footprint that these buds have. We should be looking for ways to reduce carbon footprint, not add to it. And the marijuana industry is all about growing indoors. Why? Because it's so profitable. It's so you can grow it more potently that way. And to me, it feels like all of this has been put into the hands of people with a vested financial interest in selling marijuana. And you can legalize marijuana a whole bunch of different ways. You can say there will be no pot sold more than 7% THC, just to put a number on it, for example. And there will be nobody selling it who has not been inspected almost weekly at first by an inspector from the state. And there will be nobody, on and on. There was no place growing the stuff that will not be inspected. If this is a drug, a medicine, then we need to treat it like a medicine. All the other medicines are treated. If this is a foodstuff, a consumable, we need to treat it like all the other consumables are treated. But we're not doing much of any of that, And on the contrary, we're allowing 40% buds to be sold. I think that's insane. I just think that's insane. The other thing is, data is now very clear. Neuroscience is very clear that the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead, that governs consequences and adult decision making, does not completely form in the human being until the age 25. That's why teenagers act so dumb. That's why we all acted so stupid when we were 17, 16, 17, right? So that being the case, then the age of legal consent ought to be 25, not 18 or 21. But, so we have an entire economy based on the idea that free market American capitalism should just be allowed to do whatever the hell it wants. And we should give them the tools to write the statutes. Why? Because, all kinds of little, rationales. But to me, that is really what we're seeing happen in our economy. We do not dare step in and say, no, you can't do that to a person who wants to make money.
So were we better off having marijuana illegal as an illegal substance in the US?
I don't. I think the big mistake first and foremost was to make it illegal back in the early part of last century. It was not a drug that something that needed to be made illegal, nonsense. And I really think, but the problem is, of course, we did, and then 100 years passed, and you're seeing what we have now. So I just think that there are many ways of legalizing and putting in safeguards, public health safeguards, public safety safeguards into this, and also a mature, adult, accountable approach to making sure that growers and dispensaries are not selling stuff they can't account for. And the other thing is true. I mean, there was this idea like, well, we're making marijuana illegal, and now nobody should ever go to prison for marijuana. That's nonsense. If you want somebody, a dispensary, to be able to make money enough to pay the lights and the rent and the electricity and all the rest and the marketing and all that stuff and hire employees and all that stuff, then you have got to put an end to the illegal market of marijuana. And that means arresting people and putting people in jail for a long time for selling marijuana illegally. Otherwise, you will never have the kind of market that was the marijuana was sold to us as. Well, we're now going to have a clean, well-lit place for marijuana and a lot of tax money and decent dispensaries, very much like pharmacies or liquor stores, and all of which is a great idea. I think that could work. The problem is we allowed the people with the self-interest, the financial self-interest in it all, to write the or certainly lobby and influence the statutes that govern it in state by state.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to talk a little bit about the pharma. So, this is a crazy, the story about pharma and Purdue Pharma in particular is pretty crazy. One interesting thing that I recently read is that at the time when Purdue Pharma was actually got hit with one of its largest lawsuits, other pharma companies actually increased marketing for opioids at this
Right.
time.
And I think,
and I guess
yeah,
my first question there is, when do you think, when can you pinpoint to a point in time when things started to tilt in favor, like against Big Pharma, against Purdue Pharma, against Oxycontin and company?
um, well, you're asking, I mean, I'm going to tell you, it's going to sound highly immodest, and I hate to
Please.
be immodest, but I have to say, I know I lived this. I lived this. Okay. And I think one of the key moments was when my book Dreamland came out. I know that sounds horrible, but let me explain. When I was writing Dreamland, one of the things was 2012, 13, 14, right?
Yep.
So I was writing the book right in that time period. I would go around to different places that have later appeared in the book, and I would talk to people. And I had the hardest time convincing families who had lost loved ones to addiction to go on the record, to talk to me, to tell their stories for public consumption, so on. There was a complete nationwide silence. I mean, zero talking about it. Just couldn't, remarkable, because these are people who had lost, you'd think they'd want to talk, but so many people were just absolutely ashamed, absolutely embarrassed. And the last thing they wanted to do was let people know how their loved one died or why their loved one was in I had to lie about where their loved one was. He was in Montana for the third rehab, and they were telling lies about where he went. All of this. I never found, I found like a few families that wanted to talk about it. Obituaries lied about the cover it up, the real cause of death. You just didn't see. Politicians weren't paying attention to this. Nationwide, you just didn't see it. In a couple of states, yes, West Virginia, Ohio, et cetera, Kentucky, et cetera, but not very many other places. And so I remember that experience vividly. I lived it for 2+ years. I could not believe, and everywhere I went, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, I ran into this problem where I could not find people who want to talk about it. Then the book comes out in 2015, and I could tell you over the next 2-3 years, it was remarkable. The numbers of people coming out of the shadows into the light were just remarkable. And it became one of the great grassroots political movements of our time, except no one recognized it as such because it doesn't have a president and a spokeswoman and a this and that. It didn't have an association. So it was just people coming out on their own to tell their stories. And that is what ignited all this concern about this. And people began to realize I'm not alone. When they began to read that there were many people just like them. In fact, they might have thought at one point, one woman said, I thought it was like there wasn't anybody within a 10-mile radius of my house who had this problem. Turns out there were several people on her street. Once people come out of the woodwork and begin telling their stories, then it becomes a potent political issue. Then media all across the country begin to cover it. Then politicians get on board. Then finally what began to happen was that the attorneys general in each state and Washington, D.C., 51 attorneys general eventually filed lawsuits against the pharmaceutical company, not just Purdue, but others. When I will tell you this, when I was writing Dreamland, there were 3 lawsuits from counties, and all 3 were on hold. Then all of a sudden, Dreamland comes out. All of this stuff that I just talked about has begun to happen, and in within a few years, you have 3,000 lawsuits. You have all these. You have $54 billion being dislodged from these companies to pay for what they helped cause. And to me, that I will say, I know I'm biased, but I also have to say, I don't think because I lived this, I saw it happen in real time. I think that my book was frankly a major part of that, and not the only reason, but certainly a huge part of that. And so if you ask me that question, I'm have to be immodest and just tell me I think Dreamland was a big part of it.
No, that's okay. I think it's completely fair. Also when you look at the timeline of everything, and like you said, when lawsuits really started boosting up, and towards Purdue and other pharma companies.
Yep.
I guess, I have it's something that I try to think about a lot when it comes to that, because I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. But obviously it's really, I guess, easy. This is not a defense of anyone from the Sackler family or anything like that. But my question, I guess, is this. At what point do you think it was completely clear that the members of the Sackler family, members of the board of directors, had data that was extremely clear? They knew exactly what they were doing, and still they continued to do that. Because this is, a lot of times, so I'm an attorney, I'm a corporate attorney, and a lot of times it's easy to vilify like big corporations, and sometimes it's justifiable, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's truly people trying their best and it's just not working. But I guess, when was it clear that the board of directors, the decision makers at those companies, knew that they were doing something that is completely immoral and wrong, but they kept on doing that?
I would say that they, if you want to know the answer to that question, you need to read the Massachusetts Attorney General's criminal complaint against the Sackler family, which is up on their website. Last I looked, it's 277 pages of that story, taken from subpoenaed internal records, emails, internal memoranda, reports, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very clear that years ago, they were fined in 2003, I think it was, $634 million, and for false branding. They knew what they were doing then, and they came back at it even stronger after they paid that fine, after the whole criminal case was settled, and the internal emails and memoranda and records and what have you that are cited and in that criminal complaint that were subpoenaed, all of which are publicly documented, shows that was the case. And in fact, they behaved very, very much like drug addicts themselves. That's the amazing thing. When you deal with the opioids, very quickly you become like a drug addict yourself. In this case, they were just addicted to the money. Purdue Pharma, being a company owned by the Sacklers, really was run by the Sacklers. Even though there was a president, a CEO, and all that, the board of directors really ran things. And this was not like a drug company, like typical one, because there was virtually no money. Of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars they made, virtually none of it was reinvested into research and development. Now, typically, a drug company will invest, I think, anywhere between 50 and 25% of its earnings into research and development for future products. The Sackler family did none of that. Most of that money went back to the Sackler family. In the year when they earned the most they ever made, according to the Massachusetts Attorney General criminal complaint, was 2010. Purdue Pharma funneled to the Sackler family $889 million, almost $1 billion in revenue, almost entirely from OxyContin. And they were still writing emails to the president, the CEO, to other officials in the company, saying, "What more can we do? We're losing this opportunity." They had made $889 million, and that still was not enough. They still needed more. I came away thinking, reading that entire thing over 2 or 3 times, actually, certainly various parts, I think I read far more than that, with this feeling, these guys are they're behaving like addicts. Nothing is enough. That's the essential aspect to addiction. You use and use and use, and it's still not enough. You get millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, and then they're still not enough. And to me, that was an amazing idea. And it came right out of reading that report from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, which was the first one to sue the Sackler family by name, not just Purdue Pharma, but the Sackler family. Last
one.
Sure.
What is can you talk about the Marshall Plan to Save America? You touch about it in your book.
It's a Marshall Plan of what I was proposing. I wrote this in my testimony to the Senate when I testified before the Senate Health Committee in the early 2000, I think it was 18. I felt that the opioid epidemic had overwhelmed all the infrastructure we had for treatment. Just amazing amount. We needed so much. And so I was saying what we really need is to think in terms of how we can write about recovery, how we can spur recovery. Now, that could be recovery from drugs, certainly very, very, very important, essential. Our treatment centers were overwhelmed, et cetera. And there was many things we could do to think about that. But it was also a case that a lot of places needed economic recovery, particularly like Appalachia, Rust Belt, parts of Maine, parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these a lot of places in rural America, urban America needed this. I thought that it was a moment to think more broadly about addiction, recovery. Certainly at that point, I was talking about addiction recovery, but I thought we needed to understand that we needed to think in terms of like economic recovery and probably above all, community recovery. So investing in things that helped bring people out of their houses, bring people back together, so that Walmart isn't the only place in your town where you see other people, right? And that's very much the case in a lot of towns, you know. And so I thought of that and I thought this was an important moment to just make that public, that my reporting had shown me that we had ignored many parts of the country in favor of the winners. And then yet even the winners were being battered by this problem. You know, even the wealthiest suburbs of America were being battered by this. And we needed to think in terms of recovery, drug addiction, obviously, but also economic and community recovery were absolutely essential in all this. And I thought that was, and that means thinking in terms more broadly than simply addiction treatment. It's involving the entire community. It's involving money, you know, for things like, for example, the importance to small towns of their community swimming pool. I don't think you can exaggerate the importance. It's essential. So maybe one idea was how about an endowment to help subsidize the running of small town swimming pools, which are so important to the communities all across America. You know, it's that kind of thing that I was hoping they would take up. And in fact, they spend a lot of money on treatment and so on. I think it's an idea that I think needs to be adopted or pushed by counties, by states, you know, by the federal government as well to some degree. But that was kind of my idea. And the Marshall Plan idea, because in the history of foreign policy in the modern era, there has never been a foreign policy initiative that was so successful as the idea of the Marshall Plan, which is helping people help themselves by giving loans, by giving grants, and so on. And so, and the world won. The world had seen 2 world wars in 30 years. And then the Marshall Plan and the NATO, et cetera, from some other things too. And now we haven't had a world war. Well, who knows? We'll have one. Maybe we'll have one soon. I don't know. But to me, it's like we haven't had a world war since then. The Marshall Plan was a big part of that. Created prosperity, created a desire for kind of like middle class values instead of belief in conspiracy theories and race hatred and war as the solution. And so to me, the Marshall Plan was an amazing experiment that succeeded across the board. And so I thought kind of that would be the model that I'd be working off of if I were in politics or public service.
Yeah, I think your voice is actually super effective as where it is right now, actually. Yeah, especially what we talked about before. Yeah, but you know, just last thing I wanted to tell you, and I'm gonna let you go. And first, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.
But the second thing is, like, you know, reading through your book, especially the Lease of Us, the fact that you provide these amazing anecdotes of those personal stories from all over the country, truly touching stories. And I have to say, it kind of reinstalled the, you know, faith in humanity how people come together as communities and help people in the worst and the most dire circumstances I really ever read about. It was remarkable and admirable to read about those people, and truly, you know, a lot of time when you walk on the street, you see homeless people, you become desensitized. You just become indifferent, and those stories really makes you understand there's a person behind that. There's someone who you should care about. So I wanted to really
that's kind of what I was trying
that.
to do. I really appreciated that you say that. It wasn't I was writing the story of fentanyl and meth as a way of setting up the problem we face, and the stories in the Lease of Us are about Americans in the smallest ways possible trying to repair, strengthen, rebuild a community, which I believe is finally perhaps our defense, perhaps our only defense to this, but it's very, very potent, very, very powerful. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam.
In my work. It's really great of you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Talk to you later, man.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.